My name is Sophie. I'm in my early 30s now, but this story begins when I was still learning how to measure my own worth without borrowing someone else's ruler. I'm a project manager by training, a daughter by circumstance, a wife by choice. And for a long time, I was the person people assumed would always bend without breaking. If you asked the people around me back then, they'd probably describe me as steady, quiet, dependable, the one who didn't make scenes, didn't demand space, didn't need much. I was often underestimated in a gentle way, never aggressively dismissed, just softly overlooked, as if my calm meant consent, as if my silence meant I didn't feel things as deeply as everyone else. This isn't a story about villains or heroes. It's not about revenge, and it's definitely not about winning. It's about a choice I made that still echoes in rooms I no longer sit in. A choice that sounds simple when reduced to a headline, but felt impossibly heavy when it belonged to me alone. I chose my wedding over my mother's surgery. One was a celebration, the other was goodbye. If that sentence makes you tense up, I understand. It should. It made me tense too, long before I ever said it out loud. This story isn't here to shock you or to ask for your judgment. I'm not sharing it to justify myself, and I'm not asking you to take sides. I'm sharing it because the truth is quieter than the rumors that grew around it, and because some decisions can only be understood when you walk slowly through the years that led to them. What you'll hear over the next hour is a gradual unraveling. Not a single explosive moment, but a long pattern of small dismissals, unspoken expectations, and a role I didn't realize I had been assigned until I tried to step out of it. You'll hear about loyalty that went unnoticed, about love that came with conditions, and about the kind of strength that doesn't announce itself when it arrives. There is grief in this story, but not only the kind people expect. There is also clarity, and a form of peace that came much later, after the noise faded. I promise you this: I won't dramatize what doesn't need drama. I won't exaggerate pain for sympathy or flatten people into monsters to make myself look better. This is an honest account of how one woman learned that choosing herself didn't make her heartless, just whole. Before we begin, I want to ask you something gently and without pressure. Have you ever faced a moment where any choice you made would cost you someone you loved? For most of my life, I was easy to describe, just not easy to see. To my family, I was the reliable one, the daughter who remembered birthdays without reminders, the one who filled out forms correctly the first time, the one who showed up early and stayed late, not because anyone asked me to, but because things seemed to fall apart when I didn't. My presence was assumed, not requested, like electricity, only noticed when it was gone. My mother used to say she was proud of me in a practical tone, the way someone praises a well-organized drawer. She admired my efficiency more than my feelings. When relatives asked how I was doing, she answered for me. "Sophie's fine," she'd say, already turning to the next topic. And I was, or at least I learned to be. At work, it was similar. I wasn't the loudest voice in meetings, but my notes became the action plan. People leaned on my follow-through, trusted my memory, borrowed my calm when theirs ran out. Promotions passed me by at first, not because I wasn't capable, but because I didn't demand to be seen. I mistook being low maintenance for being mature. And in my relationships, romantic, familial, professional, I played the same role, the steady background presence. I listened, I adjusted, I absorbed. No one ever said you don't matter. They never had to. It was expressed in smaller ways, in plans made without checking my availability, in decisions announced to me instead of being discussed, in emergencies where I was expected to rearrange my life without question, because I always had before. I don't say this with bitterness. For a long time, I believed this role was a compliment. Being dependable felt like being needed. Being needed felt close enough to being loved. When I got engaged, people smiled warmly, but without surprise. Of course, Sophie found someone sensible. Of course, she planned everything quietly. Of course, she didn't make a fuss. Even my wedding was treated like something that would simply organize itself. What most people didn't notice was how much of myself I had edited out to remain palatable. I didn't talk about the weight I carried because I didn't want to add to anyone else's load. I didn't express disappointment because I told myself I was being understanding. I didn't ask for emotional room because I had learned how quickly it could be taken back. In my family, especially, there was an unspoken hierarchy of needs. My mother's health had always occupied the top tier, understandably so. Illness has a way of rearranging priorities. But over time, that necessity hardened into expectation. Her crises defined the calendar. Her emotions set the temperature of the room. And I adjusted, again and again. If plans changed, mine changed first. If someone had to step in, it was me. Not because I was forced, but because everyone assumed I would, including myself. The version of me they knew was calm under pressure, endlessly accommodating, emotionally fluent, but never demanding. The kind of woman people lean on without thinking about how much weight she's holding. What they didn't know was that I noticed everything. I noticed how my sacrifices were remembered as obligations, not gifts. How my flexibility was interpreted as a lack of attachment. How my silence was mistaken for agreement. I noticed that when I spoke carefully, people listened less. When I gave without asking, they stopped asking altogether. Still, I stayed. I told myself this was adulthood. This was love. This was what it meant to be strong. I didn't feel invisible in a dramatic way. There were no tearful breakdowns in bathrooms or confrontations at dinner tables. It was quieter than that, more administrative, like slowly being filed under handled. And yet, beneath all of it, I was building a private understanding, a sense that being dependable had come at the cost of being considered. That one day, a moment would arrive when my needs and someone else's would finally collide. At the time, I didn't know what that moment would be. I just knew, without being able to explain why, that when it came, no one would expect me to choose myself. The first time it happened, I almost missed it. That's the thing about small cuts. They don't announce themselves. There's no sharp pain at first, no clear moment where you stop and say, something is wrong. It feels more like a draft in a room you've been sitting in for years. You notice it, but you assume it's temporary. You adjust your posture. You keep going. For me, it came disguised as practicality. It was a Sunday afternoon when my mother called. I remember because I was standing in my kitchen, sleeves rolled up, flour on my hands. I was testing recipes for the wedding tasting, something I was oddly excited about. She didn't ask how I was. She rarely did. She went straight to logistics. I've scheduled a consultation, she said. I'll need you to come with me. Not would you, just I'll need you. I asked, when? She told me the date. It was a weekday, during a critical phase at work. I paused, not to refuse, just to calculate. I said I'd need to check my calendar. There was silence on the line, not long, just long enough to feel like I'd failed a test. Well, she said finally, I assumed you'd make it work. That was the cut. Small, clean, almost polite. I remember apologizing immediately, explaining myself even though she hadn't accused me of anything directly. I rearranged meetings. I emailed my boss. I told myself this was what being a good daughter looked like. At the appointment, she spoke to the doctor while I took notes. I asked questions she didn't think to ask. I held her coat. When we left, she seemed calmer, relieved. In the car, she said, I don't know what I'd do without you. I let that sentence patch the cut. But something had shifted. Not externally, nothing dramatic changed. But internally, a quiet awareness settled in. I realized that my availability wasn't appreciated as generosity. It was categorized as reliable. And reliability, once established, becomes a baseline, not a kindness. After that, the pattern repeated. Plans were made with my involvement assumed. My time was treated as expandable. When conflicts arose, the solution always bent in my direction, not because anyone demanded it, but because no one considered that it might not. Once, during a family dinner, my aunt joked, Sophie doesn't have kids yet, so she's flexible. Everyone laughed, including me. I didn't correct her. I didn't say that flexibility wasn't the same as emptiness, that my life wasn't a waiting room for other people's emergencies. I noticed how quickly the room moved on. Another time, my mother scheduled a follow-up scan during a weekend I had marked for wedding planning with my fiancé. When I hesitated, just for a second, she sighed, not angrily, tiredly, as if my hesitation was an inconvenience layered on top of an already heavy burden. I went, of course I did. What struck me wasn't her need. It was how invisible my inner conflict was. No one asked what I was giving up to be there. No one said thank you in a way that acknowledged cost. And I didn't ask to be acknowledged. That's important, because silence has a way of training people. Every time I swallowed discomfort, I taught them what to expect from me. Every time I said it's fine when it wasn't, I helped normalize the imbalance. I told myself this was temporary, that once the wedding passed, once things stabilized, the scales would even out. But deep down, something else was forming, a memory bank. Not of anger, but of moments, of small dismissals, of assumptions stacked so neatly they look like care from the outside. This wasn't betrayal, it was erosion. And erosion doesn't feel like violence. It feels like patience wearing thin, grain by grain, until one day you look down and realize the ground beneath you isn't as solid as it used to be. At the time, I didn't confront anyone. I didn't make a scene. I didn't even articulate my discomfort clearly to myself. I just remembered. By the time I recognized the pattern, it already felt normal. That's how normalization works. It doesn't arrive as a warning. It settles in like routine, like gravity. You stop questioning why things fall the way they do. After the first few incidents, I adjusted my expectations instead of my boundaries. I told myself my mother was under stress. That illness rearranges families. That love sometimes looks like sacrifice. And mature people don't keep score. So I stopped keeping score. Or at least I pretended I did. When my mother needed something, I responded before she finished asking. When appointments changed, I reshuffled my schedule without comment. When wedding plans clashed with her health updates, I quietly deprioritized myself. I learned to deliver the news to my fiancé gently, as if my disappointment needed cushioning. He noticed before I did. "Do you ever feel like your life is always on standby?" he asked once, not accusingly, just curious. I laughed it off. "It's temporary," I said. I use that word a lot. Temporary has a comforting sound. It suggests an end. But weeks turned into months, and the accommodations kept expanding. My mother began calling less to inform me, more to instruct. She didn't mean it cruelly. She had simply grown used to a version of me that was always available, always aligned, always adaptable, and I reinforced it. When relatives praised me, it was never for who I was. It was for what I did. "You're such a good daughter." "She handles everything." "We're lucky to have Sophie." Lucky, as if I were a resource. If someone else couldn't make it, I filled the gap. If plans fell apart, I reassembled them. If emotions ran high, I absorbed the overflow. I became a buffer between crisis and chaos. And buffers don't get thanked, they get leaned on. I started noticing how my feelings were processed as secondary information. When I mentioned being tired, it was met with solutions, not concern. When I expressed stress, it was reframed as competence. "You're strong," they'd say. "You can handle it." Strength became a cage. The more capable I appeared, the less care I received. The calmer I stayed, the more chaos I was expected to manage. And because I didn't protest, no one thought to question it, including me. There were moments, quiet ones, where resentment flickered. Not anger, something duller, a sense of being slowly emptied. I'd feel it when I opened my planner and saw my own commitments penciled lightly, easily erased. I'd feel it when I realized I hadn't spoken about my fears or excitement in weeks. Still, I told myself this was adulthood, that everyone compromises, that I was being loving, not diminished. I began editing my reactions in real time. When something stung, I reframed it internally before it could surface. "She doesn't mean it. This isn't about me. Now isn't the right moment." There was never a right moment. At family gatherings, conversations revolved around my mother's health updates. I listened attentively, asked follow-up questions, and managed logistics. No one asked how wedding planning was going unless it was to adjust dates or expectations. Once I mentioned being overwhelmed, my mother nodded sympathetically, and then immediately launched into a new concern about her upcoming procedure. The moment passed. I didn't bring it up again. That's how disrespect becomes normalized. Not through cruelty, but through precedence. One always outranks the other until the ranking becomes invisible. I wasn't being mistreated in a way that made for dramatic storytelling. No shouting, no ultimatums. Just a steady, unexamined assumption that my life was the most flexible variable in the equation. And flexibility, over time, starts to look like consent. The most unsettling part was how good I became at explaining it away. To friends, to my partner, to myself. I defended choices I hadn't truly made. I used reason to mask resignation. I didn't feel trapped, I felt responsible. But responsibility without reciprocity turns heavy, quietly, persistently. Somewhere in that stretch of time, I stopped expecting acknowledgement. I stopped hoping for balance. I told myself that being needed was enough. What I didn't realize then was that by normalizing the imbalance, I was setting the stage for something far more painful than conflict. Because when the day came that my needs could no longer be minimized, when two immovable moments finally collided, everyone would be shocked. Everyone except me. It wasn't a conversation where the role was handed to me. No one sat me down and said, "This is who you are to us now." There was no ceremony, no agreement I signed. The role formed the way habits do, through repetition, through silence, through the quiet relief others felt when I stepped in without being asked. I was the organizer, the mediator, the one who would figure it out. In my family, that meant I became the hinge on which everything swung. Appointments, updates, schedules, emotional translation. I handled it all. My mother would speak in fragments of worry, and I would turn them into action items. I became fluent in her needs, anticipatory even. I learned to hear what she meant before she finished the sentence. And because I was good at it, no one questioned whether I wanted to be. At work, the same dynamic followed me. When projects were behind, I was added just to help. When communication broke down, I was asked to smooth it over. I wasn't assigned authority, but I was assigned responsibility. I carried outcomes without carrying credit. People trusted me, but trust, I learned, doesn't always come with respect. Sometimes it comes with expectation. In my personal life, it was subtler, but no less defined. Friends leaned on me for advice, but rarely checked in afterward. My fiancé was supportive, but even he had grown used to my emotional self-sufficiency. I didn't demand care, so he assumed I didn't need it in the same way. I became the woman who could handle things. And once that label sticks, it's hard to peel off. The role came with praise, but the praise was conditional. I was admired when I complied, appreciated when I accommodated. When I hesitated, even briefly, it created discomfort. Not anger, confusion, as if I'd broken character. There was a moment I remember clearly. My mother had just finished explaining a complicated schedule change for an upcoming procedure. I was mentally rearranging my week when she added, almost as an afterthought, "You'll stay with me overnight, right?" She didn't wait for an answer. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not panic, not rage, just a quiet resistance. I thought about the meeting I'd planned months in advance, the one I'd already moved twice. I opened my mouth to say I wasn't sure. She looked at me then, not sharply, just expectantly, and I heard myself say, "Of course." The relief on her face was immediate, visible. The conversation moved on. In that instant, I understood the role more clearly than ever. I wasn't being asked, I was being relied upon to fulfill a function. And my fulfillment of that function brought comfort to everyone else. The cost just happened to be mine. Roles like that don't feel oppressive at first. They feel earned. They come with a sense of purpose. But purpose without agency becomes obligation. And obligation, when unexamined, erodes choice. I realized that if I ever stepped out of this role, it wouldn't be received as self-care. It would be received as betrayal. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me quiet. Because once you see the shape of the box you're in, you also see how carefully everyone else has arranged their furniture around it. I wasn't the fragile one. I wasn't the center of concern. I was the support beam, essential but unnoticed unless missing. And that's when I understood something else. No one was going to release me from this role voluntarily. It served them too well. If anything was going to change, it would have to start internally, without announcements, without demands. Just a shift in how I responded. At the time, I didn't know what that shift would look like. I only knew that continuing as I was would eventually require me to disappear completely. And somewhere deep inside, a quieter version of myself, one I had ignored for years, was beginning to stand up. The day something shifted wasn't dramatic. There was no argument, no raised voices, no slammed doors or ultimatums. If you had been watching from the outside, you would have seen an ordinary weekday. Overcast, unremarkable, forgettable. That's what made it dangerous. I was sitting in my car outside the hospital parking structure, engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel. I had arrived early as usual. My mother's appointment wasn't for another 20 minutes, but I'd learned that being early reduced stress, hers and by extension, everyone else's. I remember noticing how quiet it was, the kind of quiet that hums, the kind that leaves room for thoughts you usually keep busy. My phone buzzed with a notification, a calendar reminder, wedding venue final walkthrough. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. I had completely forgotten about it, not because it wasn't important, but because I had trained myself to demote my own milestones without conscious effort. The walkthrough had been scheduled months ago. I had been excited about it once. I had imagined standing in the space, picturing where people would sit, how the light would fall. I felt a strange hollow sensation, not sadness, recognition. I realized I had missed more than just that appointment. I had missed the feeling of anticipation, of forward motion in my own life. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I just sat there, breathing, feeling something settle into place. Inside the hospital, the routine unfolded as it always did. Check-in, forms, waiting room chairs are arranged too close together. My mother talked about logistics. I nodded, responded, and took notes. At one point, she looked at me and said, "I don't know how you do all this." It sounded like admiration, it probably was. But instead of pride, I felt something else, a quiet fatigue, the kind that comes from realizing you've been running a race no one else knows you're in. Later that afternoon, after the appointment, after I'd driven her home and made sure she was settled, I returned to my car and just sat. I didn't turn on the radio, I didn't check my phone, I let the silence stretch. That's when the shift happened. Not as a thought, but as a decision that didn't yet have words. I understood that I could keep doing this forever, and no one would stop me. There would always be another appointment, another adjustment, another reason why my needs could wait. I also understood that if I didn't intervene, no one else would. Not out of malice, but because the system worked for them. And something in me finally accepted that reality without resentment. I didn't feel angry at my mother. I didn't blame my family. I didn't even blame myself. I just stopped believing that self-erasure was a prerequisite for love. That was the shift. It was subtle, internal, almost anticlimactic. But once it happened, I couldn't unsee what I had seen. I went home that evening and opened my planner. I looked at the weeks ahead, at the way my commitments were layered, color-coded, prioritized. I noticed how often my own events were penciled in lightly, with room to be erased. For the first time, I didn't immediately start rearranging. I didn't announce anything. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't draw boundaries out loud. I just paused. And in that pause, I realized something important. Silence didn't have to mean compliance. It could mean consideration, strategy, choice. I wasn't ready to act yet, but I had stopped reacting. That distinction changed everything. The shift wasn't visible to anyone else. The appointments continued. The calls kept coming. I still showed up. But internally, I was no longer moving automatically. I was watching, measuring, noting what was asked of me and what was assumed. That day, sitting in my car, I didn't choose myself in any tangible way, but I chose to stop disappearing. And once you make that choice, even quietly, every future decision carries a different weight. After that day, nothing on the surface changed. That was intentional. I didn't announce a transformation. I didn't start saying no abruptly. I didn't test anyone with ultimatums or declarations of self-care. I understood something instinctively then. Sudden resistance would only be interpreted as rebellion, as emotion, as instability. And I wasn't unstable, I was clear. So I stayed quiet, but differently. Before, my silence had been reflexive, now it was deliberate. When my mother spoke, I listened without interrupting, but I stopped filling in the gaps automatically. I let pauses linger. I let her finish her thoughts instead of translating them into solutions mid-sentence. It made conversation slower, slightly uncomfortable. No one commented on it, they just adjusted. When appointments were mentioned, I asked questions instead of confirming availability. Neutral questions, calm ones. What time is it? Who else will be there? Have you checked if that overlaps with anything? Questions create space. Space invites awareness. At work, I did the same. I stopped preemptively fixing problems that weren't assigned to me. I completed my responsibilities thoroughly, but I didn't absorb everyone else's. When someone implied I'd handle something, I waited for the explicit request. Most of the time, it never came. People mistake silence for weakness because they confuse noise with power. But silence, when chosen, becomes a filter. It reveals assumptions. It exposes reliance. I started noticing how often people spoke as if my agreement was already secured, how rarely they checked in once they believed it was. I didn't correct them. I let reality do the work. At home, my fiancé noticed first. Not because I withdrew, but because I became more present. When we talked, I wasn't half listening while mentally organizing someone else's crisis. I was there. One night he said, "You seem lighter." I smiled but didn't explain. I wasn't lighter, I was grounded. My mother, on the other hand, sensed something was different but couldn't name it. She became more anxious in small ways, asked for reassurance more often, checked in more frequently. It wasn't that I was less available, it was that I was no longer predictably available. That unpredictability made people uneasy. I still helped, I still showed up, but I no longer overextended preemptively. I stopped volunteering information about my schedule. I stopped explaining myself when no explanation was owed. And here's the thing, no one accused me of neglect. No one confronted me because I hadn't done anything wrong. I had simply stopped compensating for everyone else's expectations. That's when I understood the difference between being kind and being compliant. Kindness has choice embedded in it. Compliance does not. As the weeks passed, I began documenting, not obsessively, not emotionally, just factually. Dates, requests, changes. How often my plans were adjusted versus others. How often was my availability assumed? Not to build a case against anyone, but to ground myself in reality. To counter the instinct to gaslight myself into thinking I was imagining things. The data was sobering. I also started preparing quietly, financially, logistically, emotionally. I reviewed my savings. I updated the documents. I made sure my independence wasn't theoretical. It was functional. I wasn't planning to leave anyone. I was planning to be able to choose. That distinction mattered. Silence, I learned, isn't absence. It's presence without performance. People began revealing more of themselves in that space. Their expectation, their impatience, their discomfort when the system didn't respond automatically. And I watched, not with judgment, with clarity. Because clarity doesn't rush. It waits until the moment arrives where action is unavoidable, and then it moves without hesitation. At this point, I didn't know what that moment would be, but I knew it was coming. What they never noticed was how much I was learning, because from the outside, I looked the same. I still attended appointments. I still answered messages. I still showed up with the same calm expression, the same measured tone. There was no visible rebellion to react to, no emotional shift dramatic enough to trigger concern. That's the advantage of being underestimated. You're allowed to observe without interruption. While everyone else assumed continuity, I began preparation. Not for conflict, for inevitability. I started by paying attention to patterns I had previously smoothed over. Who contacted me only when something was needed? Who remembered me when things were calm? Who adjusted when I didn't immediately respond? And who escalated? The differences were revealing. I noticed how quickly urgency appeared when my availability wasn't guaranteed. How easily responsibility was redistributed when I didn't absorb it automatically. It told me something important. Much of what I carried wasn't irreplaceable. It was just convenient. At work, I requested documentation for processes I had been running informally for years, not as a power move, simply as best practice. I trained colleagues. I transferred knowledge. I made myself less singular. People praised my professionalism. They didn't realize I was making myself optional. At home, I organized our finances more carefully. Joint accounts were clarified, personal savings were fortified. I ensured that my independence didn't rely on goodwill or assumption. Again, no drama, no secrecy, just intention. With my mother, I became more precise. I stopped being the emotional interpreter. If she wanted something, I asked her to articulate it clearly. If she expressed fear, I listened, but I didn't immediately convert it into action unless it was explicitly requested. This was uncomfortable for her. Fear likes momentum. When momentum slows, fear gets louder. She began calling more frequently, repeating concerns she'd already shared. I listened patiently, but I didn't escalate on her behalf. I didn't call doctors unless she asked. I didn't rearrange plans unless necessary. I wasn't withdrawing care, I was returning agency. And that, I learned, can feel like abandonment to someone used to being buffered from reality. What they never noticed was how much restraint this required. It would have been easier to continue as before, to stay useful, invisible, indispensable. But I wasn't aiming to be indispensable anymore. I was aiming to be free. The wedding plans moved forward in parallel. I began reclaiming small moments. The venue walkthrough I'd missed was rescheduled. I attended it fully present. I made decisions without apology. I allowed myself to feel excitement again, tentatively at first, like a muscle relearning movement. My fiancé noticed the change. He didn't question it. He adapted. He met me where I was, not where he expected me to stay. That mattered more than I knew at the time. I also began having conversations with myself that I'd avoided for years. What do I owe, and what am I choosing to give? Where does responsibility end and self-erasure begin? If I step back, who steps forward, and why hasn't that happened yet? The answers weren't flattering to anyone involved, including me. I had enabled as much as I had been relied upon. I had confused being needed with being valued. I had trained people to overlook my limits by not articulating them. Accepting that didn't weaken my resolve, it strengthened it. Because clarity isn't about assigning blame, it's about understanding mechanics. And once you understand the mechanics, you can decide whether you want to keep the machine running. I didn't yet know what decision I would face, but I knew that when it arrived, I wouldn't meet it unprepared. I had documentation, financial stability, emotional grounding, a partner who saw me clearly. What I also had, quietly, steadily, was permission from myself. And that's the part no one noticed. Because permission doesn't announce itself. It just waits. The reveal didn't come as a shock. That surprised me most. When it finally arrived, the information that would change everything, I didn't gasp or freeze or feel the world tilt. I felt still, almost calm, as if some part of me had been waiting for confirmation rather than discovery. It came during a routine conversation with one of my mother's doctors. I wasn't meant to be there alone. My mother had stepped out to take a call, and the doctor, assuming she'd return any moment, spoke to me with the kind of professional candor reserved for families who had been around long enough to understand nuance. He mentioned a timeline, not a dramatic one, not a countdown, just a gentle factual framing of what the next few months could realistically look like. Risks, probabilities, the difference between treatment and intervention, between hopeful and curative. He wasn't unkind, he wasn't blunt, he was precise. And in that precision, I heard what no one had said clearly before. My mother's surgery, the one everyone was orbiting around, was not a promise of recovery. It was a measure of time, possibly comfort, possibly extension, possibly goodbye. When my mother returned, the conversation shifted. The doctor adjusted his language. The careful optimism returned. She nodded, reassured, anchored to the version of the future that felt survivable. I said nothing, but inside something aligned. Later that night, I reviewed everything. Medical notes, appointment summaries, second opinions. I didn't spiral. I didn't dramatize. I just read. And the picture became undeniable. This wasn't a crossroads between crisis and safety. It was a narrow corridor. The private reveal wasn't just about her condition. It was about my role in it. I realized that no matter how available I made myself, no matter how much of my life I paused, the outcome would not change in the way everyone seemed to believe. My presence was comfort, not control. That mattered, because for years, I had operated as if my sacrifice had influence, as if rearranging my life could somehow tilt the scales, as if being there enough would make the ending different. But the truth was quieter and harder. I could give everything and still lose her. And suddenly the weight I'd been carrying shifted shape. If my sacrifice couldn't change the outcome, then what exactly was I sacrificing for? That question sat with me for days. I didn't share the doctor's words, not because I was hiding them, but because I understood, with new clarity, that my mother wasn't ready to hear them. And it wasn't my job to force reality on her before she was ready. But it was my job to be honest with myself. Around the same time, my wedding plans entered their final phase. Dates solidified, deposits locked in, guests booked travel. There was momentum now. Real, tangible, irreversible momentum. And I saw it then, clearly. Two events were approaching on parallel tracks. One was a culmination, a beginning. The other was an attempt to delay an ending. They were not equal in meaning, but they were equal in weight. And they were scheduled to collide. For the first time, I didn't immediately assume which one would give way. That realization scared me. Not because of the choice itself, but because of how natural the question felt. I wasn't panicking, I wasn't hardening, I was evaluating. What does presence mean? Is love measured by proximity or by honesty? If I am there physically but fractured internally, who does that serve? I imagine myself at the hospital, distracted, hollow, watching the clock. I imagined myself at my wedding, carrying guilt like a shadow. I imagined postponement. I imagined regret in every direction. There was no clean outcome, but there was clarity. The private reveal wasn't a verdict. It was permission to stop pretending that endless sacrifice was noble if it erased me completely. I didn't decide anything that night. I just acknowledged the truth I had been avoiding. No matter what I chose, someone would be disappointed. And for the first time in my life, that didn't automatically mean it would be me. The decision didn't arrive all at once. It formed slowly, the way certainty does when it's built on accumulated truth rather than impulse. There was no single night when I sat up in bed and declared my choice. Instead, I found myself returning to the same question again and again, from different angles, until the answer stopped changing. What am I actually choosing between? On the surface, it looks simple, almost cruelly so. A wedding, a surgery, celebration versus crisis, presence versus absence. But beneath that framing was something more complicated. I wasn't choosing between my mother and myself. I was choosing between a role I had been performing for decades and a life I was finally allowing myself to fully inhabit. I played out every scenario. I imagined postponing the wedding again, calling vendors, explaining to guests, absorbing the disappointment quietly, the way I always had. I imagined standing beside my mother in the hospital, being useful, being calm, being the version of myself everyone expected. And I imagined what would follow. More waiting, more rescheduling, more shrinking. Not because anyone would demand it explicitly, but because the pattern would continue uninterrupted. Then I imagined the alternative, attending my wedding fully. Not half present, not apologetic, choosing to honor a commitment I had made not just to my partner but to myself, allowing joy to exist alongside grief without treating one as a betrayal of the other. I didn't romanticize it. I knew the cost. I knew how it would look. I knew the judgments that would form in the spaces where nuance rarely survives. And still, the answer didn't change. What surprised me most was the absence of drama inside me. I wasn't torn in the way people expect when they hear this story. I wasn't hysterical, I wasn't cold. I was steady. That steadiness told me something important. This wasn't a reaction, it was alignment. I also knew this decision was irreversible. Not in logistics, dates can be changed, but in perception. Once I stepped out of the role I'd always played, I couldn't step back in without losing myself again. And I wasn't willing to do that anymore. When I finally named the choice, to myself, it didn't feel like defiance. It felt like the truth. I would attend my wedding. I would not be present for the surgery. I didn't frame it as abandonment, I framed it as honesty. I had already arranged care. I ensured my mother wouldn't be alone. I coordinated support from relatives who had been distant but capable. I made sure logistics were covered. What I didn't do was sacrifice my own milestone as proof of devotion, because I had learned slowly, painfully, that devotion without boundaries becomes erasure. I told my fiancé first. Not because I needed permission, but because I wanted him to understand the weight of what I was choosing. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he didn't rush to reassure me. He just said, "I trust you." That trust steadied me more than any argument could have. Telling my family came later, carefully, calmly, without justification beyond what was necessary. "I won't be able to be there that day," I said. "But everything is arranged." There was silence, then disbelief. Then questions were framed as concerns but edged with expectation. I didn't argue. I didn't over-explain. I didn't defend my character. I let the discomfort exist. Because discomfort was the price of stepping out of a role that had required my constant self-sacrifice. In that moment, I understood something clearly. Choosing myself didn't mean I loved my mother less. It meant I refused to measure love by how much of myself I was willing to erase. This wasn't an easy choice, but it was the right one for the woman I was becoming. And once made, it settled into me like a decision that had been waiting for language. Once the decision was made, I didn't announce it again. I didn't campaign for understanding. I didn't seek validation. I understood that explaining myself repeatedly would only reopen the question, and I wasn't asking for permission. So I moved in silence. Not secrecy. Silence. There's a difference. Secrecy hides. Silence simply doesn't perform. I confirmed wedding details. finalized seating charts, approved timelines. I handled logistics with the same calm efficiency people had always relied on. But now, the direction of that competence pointed toward my own life. I also prepared for fallout. Not emotionally, I had done that already, but practically. I made sure my mother's care plan was airtight. Transportation, check-ins, emergency contacts. I coordinated with relatives who had been less involved, not accusingly, just factually. When responsibility is redistributed without drama, people tend to accept it more easily. Some were surprised, a few hesitated, but no one refused. That told me something important. My presence had been assumed, not required. At work, I adjusted my availability around the wedding without apology. I delegated, I documented, I ensured nothing would stall in my absence. I didn't frame it as an inconvenience. I framed it as planning. No one objected. The resistance when it came was quieter and closer to home. My mother grew more withdrawn, not angry, wounded. Her questions changed tone. She asked less about logistics and more about reassurance. "You'll call, right? You won't disappear?" I answered honestly. "I'll call. I won't disappear." I didn't promise what I couldn't give. That was new. In the days leading up to the surgery and the wedding, time felt strange, dense, compressed. Two realities advancing toward each other without touching. I existed in both without being consumed by either. I didn't post about the wedding, I didn't share updates widely, I didn't invite commentary, I protected the quiet around the choice because I understood how easily noise can destabilize resolve. People often mistake silence for uncertainty, but uncertainty needs reassurance. Silence, chosen, does not. The night before I left for the wedding, I sat with my mother. We didn't talk about the schedule. We talked about ordinary things, memories, small observations, the weather, a show she'd been watching. I didn't frame it as a goodbye, neither did she. And that, in its own way, was an act of mutual mercy. I left early the next morning. I didn't look back dramatically. I didn't narrate the moment in my head. I just went. At the venue, everything unfolded as planned. Light through windows, chairs aligned, people arriving with the soft energy of anticipation. And yet, I felt the undercurrent, the knowledge of what was happening elsewhere. I didn't suppress it. I carried it. Joy and grief are not opposites. They are parallel experiences. They can coexist without canceling each other out. I allowed myself to be present, fully. Not because it was easy, but because presence is a choice. I didn't check my phone obsessively. I trusted the systems I had put in place. I trusted that not being physically there didn't mean I wasn't caring, because care doesn't always require proximity. Sometimes it requires restraint. When the ceremony began, I didn't think about how it would look to others. I didn't imagine judgments. I stood where I was, grounded in the life I was choosing to step into. I wasn't running away. I was arriving. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They unfolded the way ripples do, quiet at first, barely visible, then widening outward into spaces I wasn't standing in anymore. At the wedding, I was insulated from most of it. Intentionally so, the people around me were present, focused on what was in front of us. Laughter, conversation, small moments that felt almost surreal in their normalcy. I didn't hide from the weight of the day, but I didn't let it dominate the room either. That came later. The first sign wasn't anger, it was an absence. Messages that would normally arrive immediately didn't come. Family group chats went quiet. Updates were delayed or filtered. Information moved around me instead of through me. For years, I had been the conduit. Now, without my constant presence, the system recalibrated. And in that recalibration, people felt the loss. Not of me as a person, of my function. Relatives who had rarely coordinated before were suddenly forced to speak directly. Decisions took longer. Miscommunication surfaced. The tension that I had long absorbed began to show. And for the first time, none of it was quietly smoothed over. I learned about this in fragments. Not from confrontation, but from the tone of conversations when I returned. Shorter, more strained. Edges where there hadn't been edges before. My mother in particular felt it. Her recovery was slower than hoped. Not catastrophic, but difficult, painful. The kind of recovery that tests patience and amplifies fear. She called me more often after the surgery than before. Sometimes to talk, sometimes just to sit in silence on the line. I listened. I stayed present. But I didn't resume my old role. And that's when the emotional consequences surfaced. Not accusations, at least not directly, but disappointment framed as confusion. I just thought you'd want to be there. I didn't expect things to feel so disorganized. There it was. Disorganized. What she meant was unsupported. I acknowledged her feelings without absorbing blame. I know it was hard, I said. I'm sorry you went through that. I didn't say I should have been there, because that wasn't true. Others were less careful. The extended family questioned my priorities in side conversations I wasn't invited into. Friends of the family offered opinions disguised as concern. It must have been such a difficult decision, they'd say, their tone implying the difficulty lay in choosing joy at all. I didn't correct them. Letting people misunderstand you is part of stepping out of a role they benefited from. What surprised me was how quickly the narrative hardened, without my participation. Stories like this want clean villains. They don't tolerate complexity well. But something else happened too. Quietly, privately, a few people reached out, not to judge but to acknowledge. I didn't realize how much you did until you stepped back. I see now how much was put on you. Those messages didn't come from the loudest voices. They came from the observant ones. And they mattered, not because they validated my choice, but because they confirmed my understanding. The system had relied on me more than anyone wanted to admit. My mother's emotions oscillated between vulnerability and distance. She needed me, but didn't quite know how to reach me outside the old dynamic. We were learning from each other again under difficult circumstances. There were moments of tenderness, moments of strain. Neither erased the other. And through it all, I remained calm. Not numb, calm. Because the decision had already been made, and revisiting it would only reopen wounds without changing outcomes. I wasn't immune to guilt, but guilt, I learned, doesn't always mean you've done something wrong. Sometimes it's just the echo of expectations you no longer meet. The consequences were real, but so was my peace. And that balance, fragile, hard-won, told me I was still standing in the right place. By the time the panic surfaced, it was already too late to fix anything. That's what people misunderstand about moments like this. They imagine a window where everything could still be smoothed over with the right words, the right apology, the right sacrifice. They assume repair is always possible if someone just tries hard enough. But repair requires timing, and timing had passed. The realization didn't hit all at once. It crept in through small disruptions, missed details, frayed tempers, conversations that went in circles because no one was translating, coordinating, or absorbing the emotional overflow anymore. My absence had revealed something no one wanted to see. I had been holding more together than anyone realized. Relatives began stepping on each other's efforts. One would arrange something, another would undo it unknowingly. My mother would receive conflicting information, and her anxiety spiked. She called me, frustrated and overwhelmed, asking why things felt so chaotic. I listened. I understood. And for the first time, I didn't rush in to correct it. Not out of cruelty, out of truth. I told her gently, "This is what happens when responsibility is shared instead of centralized. It takes time to adjust." She didn't like that answer. She wanted the old version of me, the one who would quietly fix everything without requiring anyone else to change, the one who made discomfort disappear. But that version of me was no longer available. And this is the part no one expects. Once people feel the absence of your invisible labor, they don't always respond with gratitude. Often they respond with urgency, with bargaining, with subtle attempts to pull you back into place. There were suggestions. Maybe you could stay a few extra nights. It would help if you just coordinated things again. Everyone's just stressed. It's not the time to change dynamics. Not the time. It's never the time, is it? But here's the truth I had finally accepted. If change only happens when it's convenient for everyone else, it never happens at all. I didn't refuse harshly. I didn't confront aggressively. I simply held my ground. "I can help within my limits," I said, "but I can't take that role back." That sentence landed harder than any argument could have. Because it wasn't emotional, it wasn't negotiable, it was final. The panic intensified, not dramatically, but persistently. My mother grew more irritable, more withdrawn. There were moments when she hinted at regret, not for the situation, but for me. For not raising me to prioritize differently. For not instilling what she believed should have come naturally. Those moments hurt, but they didn't break me, because I recognized them for what they were. Grief searching for control. She wasn't angry at my choice. She was angry at the loss of certainty, at the realization that the structure she relied on was no longer stable. and that realization couldn't be undone by guilt or explanation. There were attempts to reframe the narrative, to suggest compromises retroactively, to imply that things might have been different if I had just communicated more. But communication hadn't been the problem. Expectation had. By the time anyone fully grasped the weight of my absence, the decision had already reshaped the landscape. The wedding had happened, the surgery had happened, the roles had shifted. There was no reset button. And in that irreversible space, something else emerged, an unspoken understanding. They could feel it. I was no longer accessible in the same way. Not because I had withdrawn love, but because I had withdrawn compliance. And compliance, once removed, is very hard to replace. The hardest part wasn't being misunderstood. It was watching people realize, too late, that they had taken my presence for granted. Not maliciously, not intentionally, but completely. And once that realization settles in, there's no apology that can rewind time enough to restore the old balance. There is only adaptation, or distance. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was quiet. No raised voices, no slammed door, no dramatic ultimatums. Just a conversation that had been waiting for years to occur, and could only happen once everything irreversible had already happened. My mother asked to talk one afternoon when I visited her a few weeks after the surgery. Her recovery had stabilized. Not easy, but steady. The house was quiet in that way it gets when someone has had too much time to think. We sat at the kitchen table. Sunlight came in through the window, landing across the same surface where I had once organized her medications, her schedules, her worries. She didn't start with anger. She started with confusion. "I don't understand," she said. "I thought you'd be there. I always thought you would be." There it was. Not an accusation, expectation. I took a breath, not to prepare a defense, but to make sure my voice stayed even. "I know," I said, "and I understand why you thought that." She waited for more. I didn't rush to fill the silence. "You've always been the one I could count on," she continued, "when things were hard." I nodded. That's true. I didn't deny my history, I didn't rewrite it. "But this time," she said, her voice tightening slightly, "it felt like you chose something else." I met her eyes, calmly. "I did." Not definitely, not apologetically, just factually. That was the moment the air shifted. I explained, not everything, not all at once, but enough. I told her I had spent years prioritizing her needs without question, that I had done so willingly, that I didn't resent her for needing me. But at some point, I said, I stopped feeling like I had a life of my own. She flinched, not dramatically, just enough to show the words had landed. "I didn't know," she said quietly. "I know," I replied. "That's part of the problem." She looked down at her hands. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. When she looked up again, her expression wasn't angry. It was unsettled. "I just thought when it mattered most." I didn't interrupt. "You'd be there," she finished. I chose my words carefully. "I was there," I said. "Just not in the way you expected." She shook her head slightly as if trying to dislodge the idea. "I didn't do this to hurt you," I continued. "And I didn't do it because I don't love you. I did it because I couldn't keep disappearing." That sentence hung between us. This was the part where, in other stories, someone breaks down, cries, apologizes, begs for forgiveness or understanding. That didn't happen. Instead, my mother sighed, deeply, tiredly. "I didn't realize how much I leaned on you," she said. "I didn't realize there wasn't anyone else." There it was. Recognition. Not full accountability, but awareness. "I should have asked," she added. "I should have checked." I didn't correct her. I didn't pile on. "That would have helped," I said simply. We didn't resolve everything in that conversation. There were things she still didn't agree with, feelings that hadn't caught up to logic yet. But something important shifted. She stopped trying to pull me back into the old role, not because she fully accepted my choice, but because she understood, finally, that the role itself had been part of the problem. The confrontation didn't end with closure. It ended with clarity. And sometimes, clarity is the most respectful outcome two people can reach. I'm not the person I was when this story began. That isn't a rejection of who I used to be, it's an expansion. I didn't lose my capacity for care, or my sense of responsibility, or my instinct to show up when it matters. What I lost was the belief that my worth was measured by how much of myself I was willing to give away. Now, when people describe me, they use different words. They still say I'm calm, still dependable. But there's a pause now, a recognition that my time is not automatically available, that my presence is a choice, not a given. And that has changed the way people approach me. With my mother, our relationship is quieter. more fragile in some ways, but more honest. She asks now, not every time, not perfectly, but enough that the difference is noticeable. When she needs help, she states it plainly. When I can give it, I do, without resentment. When I can't, I say so, without guilt. We no longer orbit each other in the same way, and that's okay. Grief still exists between us, not just for the illness, but for the years of unspoken expectations, for the version of me she thought she could always rely on without question, for the version of her I believed I had to save. But grief doesn't mean failure. It means something mattered. In my marriage, the shift has been profound. I no longer apologize for having needs. I don't shrink my feelings to keep the peace. When conflict arises, I don't manage it alone. I trust my partner to meet me, not lean on me. That trust has deepened our bond. At work, I am still competent, but no longer invisible. I speak when it matters. I delegate without over-explaining. I let others experience the natural consequences of their responsibilities. And people respect me more for it, not because I became louder, but because I became clearer. The most important change, though, is internal. I no longer confuse guilt with wrongdoing. I understand now that guilt often appears when you break an unspoken contract, especially one you never consciously agreed to. That doesn't mean the contract was fair. I also understand that love doesn't require proximity to prove itself. Being physically present in every crisis is not the same as being emotionally available in a sustainable way. I chose my wedding. I also held space for my mother's reality. Those two truths can coexist. There are still people who don't understand my choice. There may always be. Stories like this don't resolve neatly in the public imagination. They resist simple morals. But I'm no longer trying to be understood by everyone. I'm trying to be honest with myself. Quiet dominance isn't about control. It's about alignment, about making decisions that reflect your values without needing permission or applause. I didn't win anything. I didn't defeat anyone. I simply stopped losing myself. And that, I've learned, is a form of strength that doesn't need to raise its voice. There isn't a single sentence that neatly explains what this story means. If you're looking for a clear hero or a clean villain, you won't find one here. What you'll find instead is something messier and more common than we like to admit. A life shaped by quiet expectations, by love mixed with obligation, by roles we step into slowly, until one day we can't remember choosing them at all. I didn't choose my wedding because it was more important than my mother's life. I chose it because I had spent years believing that my life was always negotiable, and that belief was slowly erasing me. One was a celebration, the other was goodbye. Holding those two truths at the same time doesn't make someone cruel. It makes them human. We are rarely asked to choose between good and bad. More often, we are asked to choose between two goods that cannot coexist. And in those moments, someone will always be disappointed. Someone will always be hurt. The question is not how to avoid that pain. The question is whether you are willing to disappear in order to spare others from discomfort. For a long time, I believed that love meant being endlessly available. That being a good daughter, a good woman, a good person meant absorbing the weight so no one else had to feel it. But love without boundaries is not love. It's erosion. What I learned, slowly, imperfectly, is that choosing yourself does not mean abandoning others. It means refusing to measure your worth by how much you are willing to sacrifice when no one else is asked to do the same. Some people will never understand that distinction. They will hear this story and focus only on the surface facts, the dates, the optics, the choice itself. They will miss the years that led up to it. That's okay. You are not required to be understood by those who benefited from your silence. If there is a moral here, it isn't always choose yourself. That would be too simple, too shallow. The real takeaway is this: pay attention to the roles you are praised for, but never protected in. Notice where your reliability becomes expectation, and ask yourself, quietly, honestly, whether the love you are offering still leaves room for you to exist. Because the most dangerous thing you can do is disappear so slowly that no one notices until you're gone. If this story stirred something in you, if you've ever been the one everyone leans on, the one who handles it, the one whose needs are always flexible, I'd like to hear from you. Have you ever faced a moment where choosing yourself felt like it would cost you someone else? I'll be reading the comments. And I won't look away.